shuffle off this mortal coil, you nothing you would do to us.
I know.
The British Marine who shot dead a wounded Afghan fighter is denied bail. Tonight, his former commander reveals the missed warning signs and lack of leadership over the whole unit.
We are obviously disappointed by the judge's decision not to grant bail this afternoon.
Good evening. It was on the field of battle. The Afghan lay wounded on the ground. The British Marine shot him dead, saying, "I've just broken the Geneva Convention," and adding, "It's only what they would do to us." The killer was convicted of murder, but his case is now to be reviewed. Today, his lawyers asked for bail, which was denied. Tonight, we hear exclusively from the Marine's commanding officer, who accepts that elements within the unit had gone rogue and talks of the missed warning signs.
And very sadly, I feel that at a series of levels above Sergeant Blackman, that sort of leadership was absent.
The man's supporters are furious that the extenuating circumstances of his state of mind were never considered and argue that he should now be free on bail. Tonight, when, if ever, can murder be justified on the battlefield?
Also tonight, a manhunt in Germany for a 23-year-old Tunisian migrant who was granted asylum there last year. Police now say that Anis Amri is the prime suspect behind Monday's lorry attack which killed 12 at a Christmas market. The government's Snoopers Charter snubbed by the European Court of Justice. The judges ruled that bulk interception of data and phone calls is illegal. And they both suffer from potentially deadly sickle cell anemia. This boy has had the life-saving treatment on the NHS. This man cannot. Why? And what should be done about it?
Plus, we asked tonight whether the Brit Awards have stopped being quite so white. After we highlighted the problem earlier in the year, they promised things would change. Have they? Big Nasty is sceptical.
Let's just hope it's not the Barack Obama thing, do you know what I mean? And then we'll be all good.
And what do you mean by that?
Just a face. You know what I mean? Just put there as face, but nothing really changes.
A Marine serving a life sentence for the murder of an injured Afghan fighter has been refused bail, pending a rehearing of his trial. Sergeant Alexander Blackman had his case referred for appeal after new evidence came to light about his mental health at the time of the killing. But tonight, this programme has new testimony from his former commanding officer in Helmand. He tells us of his warnings about the wider unit that went unheeded and speaks of a lack of leadership leading up to the Blackman killing. Our chief correspondent, Alex Thompson, has this exclusive report.
So the campaign to free Sergeant Alexander Blackman will now go on through another Christmas.
We are obviously disappointed by the judge's decision not to grant bail this afternoon. However, we must remember that earlier this month, the Criminal Cases Review Commission decided to refer the case back to the appeal courts.
No family reunion possible, of course, for the family of the wounded Afghan prisoner whom Blackman murdered. Tonight, the wider truth about this murder can be told for the first time, and it suggests that not just one man, but a whole unit had gone rogue and was effectively out of control. The senior commanders of the Royal Marines were warned about this time and again before the murder happened, but no changes were made of any significance. And when proceedings were taken against the officer concerned in the murder, those who'd made criticisms, those who'd issued the warnings were effectively silenced. Until now. Royal Marines in southern Afghanistan in July 2011. By September, commanders had been repeatedly warned that elements of 4-2 Commando had gone rogue, out of control. On September the 15th, that ended in the murder of an Afghan prisoner lying on the ground, seriously wounded. The Marines' helmet camera recorded Sergeant Blackman as he shot dead the prisoner.
Yeah, shuffle off this mortal coil, you nothing you would do to us.
I know.
Exactly. Right. Obviously, this doesn't go anywhere, fellas.
Yeah, roger, mate.
I've just broken the Geneva Convention.
Yeah, roger.
For that, Sergeant Alexander Blackman was sentenced to 10 years for murder at a court-martial.
You are at the moment achieving mission success in Nad Ali South.
Briefing his men, Blackman's commanding officer at the time of the murder in Afghanistan, Colonel Oliver Lee, he had warned his superiors Blackman's unit was a problem. Nothing happened. Lee was the youngest Marine colonel appointed since World War II. He loved the Marines. He still does. Tonight, in his first TV interview, he charts the story the court-martial never heard. The failure of one man and one unit, yes, but far wider failure of senior command.
You have got to put men and lead men into a situation where they may be shooting people 1 minute and 5 minutes later called upon to administer life-saving first aid to those same people.
I think that's a very reasonable characterisation of it. That requires exceptionally disciplined soldiering and very strong leadership to enable that soldiering. And very sadly, I feel that at a series of levels above Sergeant Blackman, that sort of leadership was absent.
At the time, Colonel Lee was so concerned he and others warned senior officers.
I was concerned about what was going on in that area, and I had made those concerns clear.
Colonel Lee wasn't alone. The internal report into the murder cites
4-2 Commando's culture was perceived by many to be overly aggressive. Moral disengagement of Sergeant Blackman and the members of his multiple. They were showing evidence of moral regression, psychological strain and fatigue.
And
Sergeant Blackman allowed professional standards to slip to an unacceptably low level.
I simply felt that the needs of the campaign at that particular moment in time, sophisticated level of counterinsurgency, didn't appear evident to me.
It was quite serious. I mean, the report that you'll be aware of course, describes them as being morally degenerate, being overly aggressive, effectively a rogue unit. Would you accept or would you recognise that characterisation? Is it right?
I mean, I broadly speaking recognise that characterisation, yes. I felt that the certain elements of the unit that I came to command right at the end of the tour were not operating in a manner that I would have wished to see them operating in, and I felt that that in relative terms increased the chances of a Sergeant Blackman type event taking place.
And you warned them about that in advance, didn't you?
Not in so many words, but yes, I did.
You said there was a problem.
I raised concerns about what was happening in that particular area in advance. Yes, that's entirely right.
another Royal Marine close to that unit told Channel 4 News,
"They were a unit of the past. It was all about getting the rounds down, smashing the enemy. Counterinsurgency wasn't mentioned."
And he too had warned commanders,
"These guys are going feral."
But once Sergeant Blackman was arrested, Colonel Lee knew what would naturally happen, or thought he knew.
I would characterise myself as an absolutely key element of the line management, and I have always been and will remain baffled, therefore, that I wasn't included in the proceedings against him.
What? They didn't ask you?
No, I wasn't asked to participate in those proceedings at any point, in spite of the fact that on a number of occasions, formally and otherwise, I attempted to become involved in them.
Hang on, a key soldier is going down for murdering a POW in cold blood. You're his line manager, and you're not asked to be involved in the investigation. That's bizarre.
I too think that's extremely bizarre.
Some would suggest it was a cover-up. Others who had warned about the unit were also not allowed to give evidence at the court-martial. Colonel Lee only found out that it was happening from the media. And that was the last straw. He resigned from his beloved Marines.
That seemed to me, in an organisation that absolutely fundamentally relies on what I describe as sacrosanct relationship between command and commanded, it seemed like a serious breakdown of that relationship, and I didn't find that able to be tolerated.
Oliver Lee's spoken out today in the hope that the organisation he still loves can learn tough lessons about the pressures counterinsurgency places on leaders as well as led.
This is an incredibly sad event, but it's not an event that unpicks 350 years worth of highly distinguished history. My sad suspicion is that the battlefields of the future will only become more complex and difficult than those of today, and goodness me, aren't they complex and difficult. And so the premium associated with learning lessons from this sort of case simply could not be higher.
Tonight, the MOD claimed they could not comment on a live legal case. When Oliver Lee was in Afghanistan, ISIS was just an Egyptian goddess. Times and challenges develop rapidly in war. Command structures must be up to the job, and that, Colonel Lee suggests, is what this sorry episode is all about.
Alex Thompson reporting there. Well, I'm joined now by the lawyer and former Army Captain Patrick Hennessy, who served in both Afghanistan and Iraq. Welcome to the programme. So we heard there, I mean, obviously, the wife's very disappointed. Many soldiers, senior officers also disappointed by today's ruling. Do you understand where they're coming from with their disappointment, or do you think they should have just taken this for granted?
I can see where they're coming from with their disappointment. I'm not a criminal lawyer, so the exact conditions over which bail are granted are not my area. But it does seem that the Crown was not opposing the idea of bail, and maybe there could have been exceptional circumstances. But I think that's a very narrow element of actually what's a much more complex, as you heard there from the former commanding officer, a much more tricky issue, which is about the relationship between the stresses of being in conflict and how the legal structures apply to that. So, I mean,
The argument in favour of Colonel Blackman is essentially that the stresses of war are so different. Civilians don't really understand that we have to make special allowances for soldiers in those sort of situations. Is that the right way to go? Is that fair?
I think it's fair to say that the stresses of combat are different. But I think what happened in this case, and as the MOD statement said, you don't want to prejudge what the Court of Appeal is going to say. There's clearly new psychiatric evidence. But my starting point for this has to be that we've all heard the audio of the gunshot that kills this injured Taliban fighter. The unit are not in contact. They're not being fired upon. There's no suggestion that that wounded person is about to attack them. And very calmly, Sergeant Blackman says, don't tell anyone I've done that because I've just broken the law. Now, I think it's a very difficult circumstance. It's very difficult for anyone who hasn't been in that situation to say what the rights and wrongs are. But you have to be almost whiter than white when you're prosecuting a military conflict like that.
But also, I mean, we're constantly going on about Assad and his alleged war crimes. How can we possibly point the finger at someone like him if we're allowing someone like Mr. Blackman to basically tear up the Geneva Convention on tape in the battlefield and get away with it?
Well, I think that's why, so far, I wouldn't criticise any of the steps that have been taken. Now, if the Court of Appeal looks at this and says, OK, well, there was material that wasn't before the court-martial and we're going to revise our sentencing, that is one thing. But I think we are still dealing in this country, and the British military is still dealing with the terrible legacy of Baha Mousa. And every scurrilous claim that has come before the Iraq Historical Allegations Tribunal is lent credibility that it wouldn't otherwise have, because on our watch, a heinous crime was committed, and we didn't come down hard upon it. Now, this is a very similar situation. The flip side, there are a lot of people saying, oh, well, he should have been let off, or different standards should have been applied. Well, look at it through the filter, as you say. What would you say to people who say, well, hang on, what just occurred on the battlefield?
So how do you explain the Daily Mail's campaign? Because this is quite extraordinary. There have been sort of similar-ish cases in the past, but this campaign, waged mainly by the Daily Mail, but also by a lot of people in military circles, is unprecedented, isn't it? How do you explain it?
Well, I think it's got huge popular support, and I can understand why that is, because there is support for the men and women of our armed forces who do a very difficult job. If one was being cynical, you'd point to the irony that the Mail, which is usually keen on locking them away and throwing away the key, is now suddenly the voice of clemency. And they're very good at riding public opinion and slightly forming it. But there's also another consideration, which is if the appeal is successful on the basis that there was diminished responsibility, this is manslaughter, not murder, that creates a potentially very dangerous precedent for every subsequent action that happens on a battlefield, because battlefields are inherently stressful places.
Patrick Hennessy, thanks very much. John.
Now to Germany. An international manhunt is underway tonight for a Tunisian man in connection with Monday's truck attack on a Berlin market. An identity document for the man, named by prosecutors as Anis Amri, was found in the cab of the lorry which killed 12 people and injured 50 more. And as in attacks in other European cities in the last year, Amri had already been under investigation as a potential terror threat. Darshna Soni is in Berlin tonight. Darshna.
There have been dramatic developments here in the last half hour in what we know about the suspect, John. Behind me, people are still turning up to pay tributes and leave candles in honour of the victims, but they are also starting to ask questions about the German police. And not far from here, a rally is being held by the far right against Angela Merkel's immigration policies, because we now know that the suspect was a Tunisian asylum seeker who should have been deported in the summer. Anis Amri was well known to the authorities here, including to counter-terrorism police. It's emerged that, as with so many of these attacks, there seems to be links with the conflict in Syria, and that Amri was under surveillance for several months because police believe he tried to plan robberies to fund the purchase of automatic weapons. Tonight, people want to know why that investigation and the surveillance against him was dropped. This is the man being hunted across Europe, a 24-year-old Tunisian named Anis Amri. A European arrest warrant issued for him today states that he has used 6 different aliases and should be considered armed and dangerous. His ID was left behind in the truck used in Monday night's attack, a classic calling card tactic used by terrorists. Detectives are focusing their search on Emmerich in West Germany, but the suspect has an 18-hour lead on the police because initially the authorities here arrested the wrong man, a Pakistani asylum seeker released without charge. Extra security patrols in Berlin today, a show of strength partly to reassure the public as the police face questions about their investigation. It's emerged that the suspect should have been deported in the summer. Amri had applied for asylum, but his application was rejected. He was known to the police, and in November his name came up in a terror investigation. He should have been under police surveillance but went underground. Detectives believe he has links to radical Islamist networks in Germany.
This person has been noticed by various security authorities in Germany in the context of contacts to Islamic radical circles. I cannot go in further details on this.
Liebe Geschwister im Islam.
This is one of the extremists that Amri has been linked to. Known as the Faceless Preacher because he hides his identity, Abu Wala was arrested in November along with a group accused of recruiting fighters for ISIS in Syria. 5 kilometers from the scene of the attack, officers have been searching the area from which it's believed the truck was taken. This is the factory where the Polish driver came to make his delivery, but he was a day early and was told to come back. That's when detectives believe that his truck was hijacked and he was killed. The area of woodland here is also still cordoned off. Now, this industrial estate is linked by this bridge across the river to a residential area. And detectives are asking who may have planned the attack and did they have this area under surveillance for some time. Angela Merkel chaired a cabinet meeting today. The attack has come at a sensitive time for the Chancellor, who is running for a 4th term next year. The attacks have again brought criticism of her immigration policy. This sign refers to victims of Islamic terrorism. The far right have held a rally this evening. Your party has been accused of exploiting the attack and linking it to the migration crisis. What do you say to that?
Now that we know that the person they're looking for, most likely, is an immigrant coming from Tunisia, I don't think anyone is using this information. We would just want justice. We want a change in policy.
12 people are still being treated in hospital tonight following the attack. A reward of €100,000 has been offered for information leading to Amri's arrest.
Sony in Berlin. But let's speak to Sergei Lagotinsky, who's a fellow of the Global Public Policy Institute, specializing in legal, political and security issues, and he joins us now live from Berlin. Sergei, let me start off by saying that it sounds to me as if this is a colossal embarrassment for the German police, but also the German state.
It is a difficult situation. It is difficult not just from the law enforcement perspective. It is also difficult because most of the issues, and there is a bundle of all issues, immigration issues, which come up with this case, are very heavily debated among different parties. I'm talking here about, bringing people back to the countries of origin. In fact, just a couple of weeks ago, the government tried to bring about 40 Afghan people back to Afghanistan, and they were not able to do that because Merkel is not the only one, and the Conservatives are not the only one force in the government. In fact, the upper house chamber is controlled by the Greens and Social Democrats, and they block many of such initiatives. So Merkel is now kind of squeezed between the right and the left, and the best way how you can deal with this situation is communication. This is precisely the deficit of Angela Merkel during the past months. She was a poor communicator.
Right, but also on the specific issue of looking for this particular suspect. I mean, if it was indeed him, this is someone who was known to the police, and this is not unusual in these terror cases. We had something similar in Brussels and in Paris. I mean, was this a failure of police surveillance? Are there simply too many suspects out there that they're dealing with? What do you think the truth in this is?
I think this is a combination of things. I mean, the communication between agencies is always a weak point, and we see this on the European level especially. But here it was more kind of a German specific case. Another problem here was that the authorities are saying they were waiting for documents from the ID documents from Tunisia in order to confirm his identity, and these documents arrived just after it was confirmed that he was also the perpetrator of this attack. So we are back to the question of also how to cooperate with the countries of origin. Right. We know that our government was trying to achieve agreements with them in order to, set the right incentives, and a lot of people on the right are saying this is the right way, and a lot of people on the left are saying this is the wrong way because of the human rights record.
Let me just ask you this crucial question. Germany has taken in over 1 million migrants and refugees in the last year and a half. Hundreds of thousands of them have already been settled in communities, and yet you have a political climate where the suspicions have risen to fever pitch, understandably. What happens to those migrants who are already settled, and what happens to the political environment in this crucial election year?
The political environment has already been poisoned before this attack because a lot of people, especially in eastern Germany, do not understand the immigration policies of the chancellor. But at the same time, chancellor was carried by people in the center and in the left. I mean, she depends on a lot of support in the political mainstream. That was saved her. But the question is, would it be sufficient not only to save her politically, but save her politically as a chancellor? And this is a question of whether she will lose votes to the left and lose votes to the right at the same moment. And her policy of muddling through is a big risk of doing so.
In one word, will she be the chancellor next year? One word.
Well, we will see how Merkel is going to react. That's up to her.
Okay. Sergei Lagotinsky, thank you very much indeed. John.
Here, some streets around Buckingham Palace are to be closed during the changing of the guard as part of a tightening of security in the wake of the Berlin attack. The closures, set to last for an initial 3 months, have been planned for some time, but have been brought forward in light of the Berlin lorry attack. The threat to the UK from international terrorism remains severe, meaning an attack is highly likely. The government's so-called Snoopers Charter is to be watered down after the European Court of Justice ruled parts of it are illegal. Judges in Luxembourg say communications data, like emails, phone records, can only be accessed by the government to fight serious crime. At the moment, powers are much broader, allowing the bulk interception and retention of data for up to a year. Jane Dodge has this report.
Big Brother may be watching and listening, but government surveillance has gone too far, according to the European Court of Justice. It says parts of the so-called Snoopers Charter are unlawful, particularly the retention of all internet and phone data for a year. Civil liberties groups have welcomed the ruling.
We think it helps us a great deal. If what is a relatively minor intrusion on privacy, the retention of communications data by communications companies is found to be inadequately protected by safeguards, the same principles must apply to other powers in the Act, which are far more intrusive. Powers of the government or the security services to get communications data in bulk, powers to hack people's computers, powers to access email communications.
It's highly embarrassing for the Prime Minister. As Home Secretary, she oversaw the introduction of the Data Retention and Investigatory Powers Act. And it was her very own Brexit Secretary, David Davis, who, as a backbencher, instigated the legal challenge back in 2014, along with Labour's Deputy Leader Tom Watson.
It's more intrusive than, I don't know, the Stasi had. So it's not right for a free society to allow that.
Brexit may mean less EU intervention in British politics, but not quite yet. The European Court of Justice has ruled that general and indiscriminate retention of data must stop. It says it can only be justified in cases of serious crime and must be authorised by an independent authority, like a judge, and not a senior police officer. A Home Office spokesperson said they were disappointed with the judgment. They added, "We will ensure that plans are in place so police and other public authorities can continue to acquire such data in a way that is consistent with EU law and our obligation to protect the public." As extra security measures were introduced at Buckingham Palace, intelligence agencies expressed their concerns that today's court ruling could hamper anti-terrorist policing.
If it's interpreted in a sensible way, then it's good news because it's a further strengthening of the safeguards. If, on the other hand, this ends up tying the police in knots and delaying the arrival of information on which cases like kidnapping could depend, then it would be a very bad day.
So will the government have to rein in its surveillance? The Court of Appeal will decide how to apply the European ruling in the new year.
Jane Dodge. With me in the studio to discuss today's ruling is Jim Killock, director of the Open Rights Group, one of the organisations which brought the case against the government. The Home Office was unable to make anyone available to speak to us, but pointed us instead to the expertise of Professor Anthony Glees. He's director of the Centre for Security and Intelligence Studies at the University of Buckingham. He joins us from Woodstock in Oxfordshire, and presumably you can voice the government's anxiety about what's happened today.
Well, I'm not sure the government is as anxious as people might think. The government will appeal. They'll also try to ensure that the latest raft of legislation, passed only a few days ago, becomes compatible with the sorts of things that the European Court of Justice has ruled on. However, it's very important to note that the Lisbon Treaty, which governs our relations within the European Union, and we still are within the European Union, specifically says that national security is absolutely not a European Union matter. In other words, the fight against terrorism and the use of interception against terrorism to a large degree, and we're very good at it in the United Kingdom, as we've just heard. They're fairly bad at it in the Federal Republic of Germany. That will go on. That won't be affected. What this is about, though, and I think this is the more difficult area, is the politics of interception. What is acceptable?
Well, let's pause you there. Let's pause you there, because that's what our other guest is fairly hot on, I suspect, which is, in the end, a human rights issue.
Yes, I mean, this is about the retention of a lot of data, the access of that data by 40-odd authorities in the UK. All of the access of that data happens without external authorization at the moment. So it's a police officer authorizing another police officer. The people whose data is accessed are not notified. They're not told about it. And of course, it's retained for a year in a blanket fashion. So everybody's data, your data, my data, everybody who's viewing this, their data is kept, along with now internet connection records, so the history of what you read on the internet. Of course, that is chilling. We know, for instance, on Wikipedia, people are no longer visiting pages about extremism to learn about that because they're under fear that they're being watched.
Well, Professor Glees does say that the effect of this case today is that they will have been more cautious about drafting the new legislation.
Well, what's surprising about this is we've just had a new bill. We've got this Investigatory Powers Act. This judgment has merely reiterated what the European Court said 2 years ago. It said you have to put safeguards, you must have independent authorization. The government just ignored it, and that's quite shocking.
Professor Glees, I mean, was there nothing about what the government has done that gave you some slight sense of queasiness?
There is nothing that the government has done in the latest legislation.
No,
it's all
I mean
bit
about the case
legalities.
About this case.
No, well, I think what the government will try to do is to meet the objections raised by the European Court of Justice in Luxembourg. It will try to define more closely those areas where bulk retention, that's really what we're talking about. We're talking about the bulk retention of communications data, not the contents, but the name, address, and so forth. That's what we're talking about. Now, the argument that we hear from the civil liberties lobby is that this affects everybody. I mean, David Davis, who's now in the government, of course, went to the European Court of Justice in the first place with Tom Watson and said it's as if the whole of Britain was under suspicion. That is total nonsense. What's more, by retaining data, and all the government is saying it should be retained for a year, which isn't very much, you can exonerate people. I mean, think of the role that DNA has played in getting people off the odious death rows of the United States of America.
OK, well, let me pause you
You've
there.
got the civil liberties lobby.
And put these points to Jim Killock. I mean, Jim Killock, for example, if in fact this act had been used to sweep up some of the best of the tax evaders in this country, you'd be thrilled.
Well, I think, there's a right to investigate people who are under suspicion. That, of course, should happen.
I think I've caught you there. You seem to be slightly hesitant.
No, look.
I mean, surely one of the worst crimes that can be committed against a society is tax evasion and avoidance.
Do we want everybody... last week, a journalist was revealed to have had his data accessed by a police officer who was upset that he was investigating his fraudulent trips with his girlfriend to the States. And that's the kind of abuse you get when you've got blanket retention and no serious authorisation system. Journalists have been one of the biggest targets here, and that doesn't just affect the odd person, that's the whole society's free speech undermined.
OK, I mean, free speech is obviously a big issue, but I mean, would you take my point on tax evasion? Would you be excited to have what was used today, Professor Cleese, in the court case that was heard today? Would you be happy to see it used against tax evaders?
Of course. I mean, I think it is very important that people, the civil liberties lobbies, led by David Davis, I should say, should stop trying to place privacy above security and the well-being of society as a whole. Privacy is important, but security and the well-being of society is an absolute. It's only by mining data. The way the intelligence community do this is the way we all do it when we use Google. They're not after everybody, they're after particular targets, and they need this data in order to discover networks. That's what the Germans did clearly not do in the case of Berlin. That's why they're running around in great confusion. They don't do it. They could do it. They don't do it.
Professor Cleese, thank you very much. Jim Killock, I'm sorry we've run out there, but thank you very much.
Just say, think about Le Pen having access to this stuff. Think about all the far-right organisations having access to these powers. That's the real threat that we need to deal with.
Let us leave the viewer thinking.
John.
Matt.
Now, Jeremy Corbyn has been given something of an awkward Christmas present by one of his MPs. Jamie Reid is to resign his seat of Copeland in Cumbria at the end of January. Mr Reid was a shadow health minister until he quit in protest at the election of Mr Corbyn as Labour leader in 2015. Well, our political correspondent, Michael Crick, is in Westminster. Michael, is this a big problem for Jeremy Corbyn?
It's certainly a by-election he could do without. Mr Reid is resigning to go and work at the Sellafield nuclear complex, where he used to work and which is in his constituency. He says his resignation isn't personal, nothing to do with Jeremy Corbyn, but his disaffection with the Corbyn regime is no secret. Indeed, he stepped down from the front bench last year within a minute of Jeremy Corbyn being elected leader. And the problem with this seat is it's not just pro-nuclear energy, it's also pro-nuclear weapons, because they make Trident subs just down the road in Barrow. What's more, the area voted more than 60% in June pro-Brexit, and UKIP will be hoping under their new leader to pick up those Labour working-class voters who voted for Brexit. So I think it's probably right that the bookmakers tonight are saying the Conservatives are favourite to win this seat. And if that were to happen, it would be the first time in 35 years a governing party has picked up a seat in a parliamentary by-election.
Michael, thank you very much.
To Syria now, where in the last few hours buses have resumed the evacuation of civilians, doctors and rebels from East Aleppo after they'd endured a punishing 24-hour wait in the freezing cold. The operation was put on hold after negotiations over the evacuation from both Aleppo and 2 Shia villages in Idlib province broke down, with rebels and government forces blaming each other for the delays. Diana Magni has this report.
As if life in eastern Aleppo was not harsh enough, snow compounding the wait to get the last 3,000 out, fighters and civilians. These buses were meant to leave yesterday morning, but they didn't, held up by wrangling between militia groups on the ground. The Syrian Red Crescent powerless to do much except wait. 30 hours later, this news.
There are about 20 buses that are in the process of leaving, and I understand that there's other buses that remain ready in order to evacuate more people.
At dusk, the first arrivals from the east to Al Rashidin on the city's outskirts. Once a front line, now a busy transit point. Little children who've already seen more than any child should, discharged from this first leg of their journey into a wintry chaos. There are buses that can take them on to the countryside west of Aleppo or further to Idlib province. Those with money can choose where to next, but most don't have any.
When the evacuation will end, I mean, our team and the Syrian Arab Red Crescent team, they are working day and night, and they will continue throughout the night in order to speed up the process. So we expect maybe later tonight or early tomorrow morning.
Images of these last few busloads broadcast on Syrian state TV, all that's stopping Assad from declaring total victory over Aleppo. But it was Hezbollah which broke the news the evacuations were back on, a key player in Syria's ground war, an ally of Assad. Opposition activists who'd made it out before had this to say about the hold-up.
The evacuation should have happened yesterday, but the Iranians are demanding more conditions. They are trying to profit from the women and children of eastern Aleppo. Now they are demanding to get more buses out of Foua and Kefraya.
Because this was all about deal-making. The rebels, extremists in amongst them, control Idlib province. But there are 2 Shia towns there, Foua and Kefraya, which are under siege by Sunni militants. And Iranian-backed militias, including Hezbollah, wanted their fighters and families out and taken to Aleppo. In return, the rebels wanted a similar deal for the besieged parts of Zabadani and Madaya, towns in the mountains close to the Lebanese border, under bombardment by Assad from the sky and Hezbollah on the ground. The last few buses out of eastern Aleppo contingent on these various moving parts. Far away from Syria now, speed track to Ankara, Banar al-Abed, the 7-year-old whose tweets from Aleppo were read by millions, met with the Turkish president.
I would like to thank you for supporting the children of Aleppo and help us to get out from war.
The symbol of Aleppo's suffering embraced by a strong man's PR machine. He may have let her and her family through, but Turkey's border is a barrier to most. And until there's an actual peace deal, Aleppo's evacuees have simply replaced one war zone with another.
Now then, sickle cell anemia is the most common inherited blood disorder in the UK, affecting 15,000 people, mostly among those with African or Caribbean backgrounds. Bone marrow transplants from a related donor offers hope to some patients of a cure, and medical advances have made it a safer procedure. But while children can have the operation under the NHS, adults cannot. Our health and social care correspondent Victoria MacDonald has this report. And if you're squeamish about needles, look away now.
What are they doing?
Every week, Adewale Lawal comes to Edinburgh's hospital in Cambridge for a blood transfusion. It dominates his life. It affects his work. Yet it's the only treatment he can tolerate for his sickle cell anemia.
So have you been busy? Yeah.
Sickle cell anemia is the most common inherited blood disorder in the world. In Britain, about 15,000 adults and children have it, mainly from the African and Caribbean communities.
Okay, it's the usual 30 minutes. 30 minutes.
It affects the red blood cells, making them rigid and sickle-shaped. It can cause severe pain, anemia and organ damage. Adewale himself has now had 2 strokes. It's affected his speech, and he has a high chance of having another. Yet there is a potential cure, a stem cell transplant, bone marrow taken from a donor.
The doctors at King's College said to me, you can do it, you can get a stem cell transplant. It will, although it's a serious procedure, it will possibly change your life and how you function afterwards, as in no sickle cell.
Okay, that's the size.
The problem is NHS England will currently only pay for children to have the transplant. Indeed, we met 6-year-old Rayhan and his mother Yar. He had a stroke at 8 months and by 3 needed the operation. And a new technique meant his mother, although only a half match, could be his donor.
It's definitely on occasion when they come to you, and because it's either day 14, between day 14 and day 21 after the transplant, where they tell you that the body has taken the bone marrow, you know, so as from now, in effect, it's producing the right blood, etc. So the only way is kind of like up.
And was the risk worth it?
I don't have to worry that I'm going to get a phone call that he's had some sort of a crisis, etc. If I get a phone call, it's just the normal thing. He's got a bug, he felt sick, he hurt himself, whatever. There's nothing, you know, and for him, I'm happy for him in terms that he can do whatever.
Certainly it's a risk Adewale is willing to take, but NHS England has turned down all adult applications, including his. The alternative, doctors told him, was to go to America.
The only disadvantage of the US is that you would have to drop everything and go to the US, stay there for 4 months, go back 2 months later, and go back every 6 months for 3 years.
NHS England says it's waiting for more research before making a decision on adult transplants. But experts say this is frustrating.
I think it isn't something for everybody. I think we should be finding out more about it in clinical trials. But I think whilst we're waiting for those to be started, there are some patients who would really benefit from the procedure. And I'm not sure the best way to make the decisions about those, but I can see it's very frustrating for patients who are, you know, extremely unwell and can't have this, and they know that if they were in a different country, they might get it done.
Adewale has now found a third way. King's College Hospital in South London has agreed to do the transplant not on the NHS, but at a cost price of £65,000. A crowdfund appeal means he is nearly there. Doctors here will use a new protocol developed in America, which is safer for adults, even if they have organ damage. It uses less chemotherapy and fewer immunosuppressant drugs, and it has an 85% success rate if there is a fully matched donor. And Adewale has one of those, his brother. So all being well, he will come to King's College Hospital in February for the operation which he desperately hopes will cure him. And Adewale absolutely understands the risks, but he says his quality of life now is so low, there is no option.
If I can do it and it be successful, I can then show the NHS that they should be funding this. You know, I will be on their back afterwards, you know, asking for more money back. But no, I'll be on their back afterwards to allow this treatment for other people.
Victoria McDonald with that report.
After the break, with the Brit Awards coming up in the new year, we investigate whether the organisers are living up to their promise to introduce more diversity in their nominations and voting groups.
In Mexico, dozens of people have been killed or injured in a series of explosions which have ripped through the country's biggest fireworks market. Balls of flame and a large plume of smoke were seen rising from the San Pablito market near Mexico City. The blast killed at least 31 people and severely burned dozens more. The market was busier than usual, with shoppers stocking up on fireworks to celebrate Christmas and New Year. According to local media reports, there were 300 tons of fireworks at the market at the time of the explosions. The same market was also heavily damaged in similar circumstances back in 2005.
After the Oscars and Grammys, it was the turn of the Brit Awards earlier this year to face allegations of a lack of recognition for black and minority talent. When Channel 4 News highlighted their diversity problem at Britain's most important music awards, the organisers promised that they would change. The writer and broadcaster Jasmine Dottiwala has gone back to them to see whether they did.
Let's go. Look. Man, try to say he's better than me. Tell my man, shut up. Shut up. Mention my name in your tweets.
Multi-award winner Stormzy was one of the biggest things to happen in the music scene over the past year. This video alone got 42 million views.
Couple man call me a backup dancer. On stage at the Brits, I'm a backup dancer.
He's performed at international festivals, won MOBO awards and more, and yet he wasn't recognised by the Brits. And neither were many others, including the award-winning Section Boys,
Everything like
I am the realest guy, or Lady Leisure.
I'm a hurricane, yeah, and Katrina. Fashion week and it's shut down. Went to the show sitting in the front row in a black tracksuit and it's shut down.
And Mercury Prize-winning Skepta is so huge that one of the biggest acts in the world this year, Drake, has signed to his label and not the other way round. Earlier this year, Channel 4 News confronted the Brits about not acknowledging the hugely popular British black artists at all. Back then, they said they were putting together a new diversity committee to ensure that future nominations would be more diverse and no longer overlooked. Now speaking for the first time, the man who is responsible for the Brits has told us what he's done to make sure things really do change.
The Brits Academy is made up of over 1,000 voters from all across the industry who are all music experts. And every year we naturally change about 300 of those anyway. But this year we decided to change over 700.
And surprisingly, he said that Stormzy's public humiliation of the Brits was the wake-up call they badly needed.
Because it's brought attention to it. It gave me a kick in the pants that I need to get, get things moving a lot more quickly.
And so was your hand forced?
No, it wasn't forced in the slightest. As I said, we had to stand up and say, actually, you know what, we're not moving quickly enough here.
So the Brits has had a checkered history when it comes to British black music acts. Soul to Soul, Craig David, the grime music industry. Why has it been ignored for so long?
Well, every year somebody feels we've ignored them. Last year it was rock music acts. The year before it was dance music acts. And this year it was acts from the grime community. And, in my opinion, one of the reasons we've sped up the changes for this year is I think that the Academy wasn't picking up quickly enough more emerging artists and trends in music.
After our initial coverage of the controversy earlier this year, I was invited to join the newly formed Diversity Committee and then the main voting academy. At a recent new members meeting, I asked the other members for their reaction.
Today marks hopefully a change, but my thing is diversity isn't the word, change is the word. So we want change. The Brit Awards hasn't just been too white, it's been too old boys club. It needs to become updated, and let's get British music represented properly.
And it's got to be changed. There has to be change. It's been too long.
Yeah, I wasn't surprised at all. I mean, you saw it with Oscars so white, Grammys so white, etc. And it was bound to happen at some point. Like I said, there's going to be acts who are going to be making waves, and they're going to get missed out because of these old criteria.
But hopefully you're going to see a little bit more of a tan across the new votes and the new artists that you're going to see on board.
I think it's great. I think it's really what needed to happen. I think it's definitely been like, old white boy brigade voting. It was blatantly clear.
Came out the womb and it was doomed. G-man had plastic, I never had no silver spoon.
We caught up with grime star Big Nasty during the filming of his new music video. Does he think things will really change?
I hope so. Let's just hope it's not the Barack Obama thing, do you know what I mean? And then we'll be all good.
And what do you mean by that?
Just a face. You know what I mean? Just put there as face, but nothing really changes. A lot of this stuff has been kept behind as a dirty little secret, innit? It's like a joke between peers. Like, they'll never get in. it's like, if all the homeless people slept in the estates, yeah, do you think they'd ever get any help? It's the fact that they're sleeping in Oxford Street, outside Harrods. Do you know what I mean? You have no choice but to look at them. But if it was kept behind closed doors, then only people with true character and true heart would do something, who actually care. But out in the open, where it's publicised, people who don't care, who just have to look good, they're forced to do something now.
In a month's time, nominations for the next awards will be announced. Will this be the start of a new beginning? Maybe.
Before any change, there's a little pain. And I think in a way, sometimes you kind of need a kickstart. It's like an electric shock to kind of make everybody kind of go, do you know what, actually this needs to happen. The main thing now is that everybody who is on the new committee, it being, 50% women, it being, more black and ethnic minority, it being younger, has got to vote. We've seen what happens in elections when people don't vote. We've seen that in politics, we've seen it everywhere. So people have to vote and they have to make their voices heard.
That report from Jasmine Dotiwala. Now, it is less than a month before climate change skeptic Donald Trump takes over the White House. He won the US presidential election partly on a platform of using more fossil fuels with fewer environmental rules. Now, President Obama has announced climate protections which his successor might not be able to reverse. Porrick O'Brien is in Washington. Tell us more, Porrick.
Well, John, President Obama announcing that in US-owned parts of the Arctic and Atlantic that they would be indefinitely off limits for the future drilling of oil. Now, the outgoing president said, and I'm quoting here, he was taking the action to protect a sensitive and unique ecosystem that is unlike any other region on Earth. Talking about the Arctic there rather than presumably Trump's America in 2017. But that new administration will find this difficult to reverse. And that's because President Obama used an old piece of legislation from back in the 1950s, which essentially enables him to ban the leasing of offshore resources indefinitely. How did Republicans react to this? Here's how they did.
The Arctic's going to be developed. We know that. So now what we're going to see is companies taking their resources and their capital to places that don't have the high standards that we do, to places like Russia.
Well, of course, Donald Trump has his own pretty strong views about the environment, yes?
Yes, he does. I mean, we're seeing again the rhetoric during the campaign really been fleshed out in concrete terms here. He's loading cabinet positions with fossil fuel promoters. We have the boss of the Environmental Protection Agency, the heads of the Department of Energy, all climate change deniers. And then, of course, we have Rex Tillerson, the man that Trump wants to be Secretary of State. He's the boss of oil giant ExxonMobil. Environmentalists have dubbed that appointment an epic mistake, said it'd be like appointing the boss of a tobacco company to be Surgeon General. He's also on record, though, interestingly, talking about lifting sanctions against Russia. Now, that could lead to a bizarre situation where US oil companies are drilling in the Russian-owned part of the Arctic, but not allowed to drill in the American-owned section of the Arctic, which would be a bizarre situation for America to find itself in. So really, I guess what we're taking from today, John, is that this sort of policy swan song by Barack Obama is very much out of tune when it comes to the orchestra ahead.
Porrick O'Brien in Washington, thank you very much. And of course, there's a lot of other environmental issues that Mr. Trump has raised, which were not addressed by the president. Our main headline tonight, a court-martial has refused bail to Sergeant Alexander Blackman, pending the appeal of his murder conviction. The Marine shot dead and injured Afghan fighter, a commanding officer who served in Helmand, has told this programme he had concerns about the mental state of members of Sergeant Blackman's unit.
Indeed. Thank you very much for watching. That's all we have time for. I hope you have a wonderful evening, and we'll be back again tomorrow, John and myself.
That is Channel 4 News. Good evening.
Good evening.